All right. Thanks everybody for joining us. It's the Programmability and Automation Meetup group. Uh, Today we have Ben Novak from F5. He's here to talk about F5 and Visual Studio Code and supercharging your automation development. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Ben.
Thank you. Thanks, Nick. Nice to meet everybody. So, starting as a network engineer in my early days, um, I knew a lot about route and switch. I knew a lot about CLI, but working my way up the stack and understanding more about applications and how they worked was a lot of fun for me. I did really good with databases and some development work and even server administration in some of my early years as I was learning and getting into the field. In the modern day, as I was really trying to look into automation and programming, learning different languages to do all that with, it's certainly a path and a struggle, and there's a big hill to climb there. Some of the big things that I struggled with were just understanding what REST was. How does it work? What is it? Learning JSON and JSON structures, and then trying to translate that into YAML and things. So it's part of the process, and then also F5 had built a bunch of different add-ons or bolt-ons. They were basically node processes that kind of got attached to TMOS and integrated with different features, mainly the API to provide endpoints for automation and to provide a declarative interface and help enable customers to deploy applications and manage devices better. As I was really learning AS3, I had to learn a lot of stuff about, JSON and REST and all these things that I hadn't worked a whole lot with in my Cisco or even networking history. One of the key points that I ran into when I was on my journey was using VS Code to reference a schema to build the declarations, right? These are all in JSON and they have a bunch of details in them, but understanding having real-time feedback about the JSON declaration that I was building and whether it was correct or wrong, or even the parameters that were available at this particular piece in the JSON structure was a pivotal point for me in my learning development and getting into automation and doing all these things. During that same time, I was also looking at how can I do more programmability, what languages can I pick up, and obviously Python is a very popular language out there. So I went to PyCon 2019 in Cleveland, and when I was there was a lot of really cool stuff, a lot of people talking, a lot of businesses and developers and fellow engineers that were talking about how they were streamlining and creating a lot of business value via automation, whether that's Ansible or just Python and redeploying applications. And that was incredibly inspiring. But near the end of this particular conference is when Microsoft and VS Code, they had a huge presence there and they were showing all the value of VS Code. And it really kind of hit me when they started talking about remote SSH in VS Code. So using VS Code remote SSH, I was able to connect directly to a big IP. I could develop Python scripts and automations, and I can even integrate that into other things. And that was another key point. As I learned the VS Code ecosystem and all the great extensions that were out there, including Ansible and even the Eclipse plugin and a bunch of other things. I mean, you look at Azure and see all the plugins through VS Code, you can see that there is a ton of enablement and wrapping that environment, that development environment into different APIs and different methods to make all that automation and authoring a lot more simple. That's a long story to get me to where the point is, and that is I saw this ecosystem in VS Code. I was learning all this automation and languages, and it was pretty tough. It wasn't very streamlined for me to go from building a declaration in VS Code to posting to copying it and pasting it into Postman and then running a Postman collection and doing all these automations. I started putting things together and the ideas. I was seeing all these great extensions and all this extensibility and functions that were happening within VS Code. And I thought, why can't this happen for F5? Hey, Joss, you got a question? Well, just let me know. Speak up. I like to have conversations. I don't want this just to be me talking. I like working with the crowd. So VS Code and all their extensions, there's a lot of functionality and there's a lot of different technologies and vendors out there that are enabling people to author automated solutions via that. And F5 needed a presence. So I was learning automation for AS3 and declarative onboarding, application templates, and being able to deploy F5 services, and I wanted to put them together. I also wanted to learn more languages, and this is where the VS Code extension came around. So it's very similar to Postman or a collection, but it just wraps all that and kind of puts it together and does some things for you. You don't have to manage a whole lot, which the biggest thing was having a list of devices to connect to and manage and not have to worry about the passwords or discovering services and kind of linking all these API calls together. Anybody have any experience with F5 and the VS Code extension in the crowd? No? Okay. Thank you. We don't. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen and we're going to jump right into VS Code. At this point, I'm actually using a development instance. So I'm going to spend the first half or the first 15, 20 minutes, and we're going to talk about using the VS Code extension and how it integrates with F5 products and a lot of the different features, functionality, and ways that we've gone with it. And then the second half, we'll kind of change gears and we'll talk about actually developing a VS Code extension because that was a process and a wonderful journey all in its own. All right, Nick, we see a simple VS Code window here.
Yep, looks great.
All right. So to get started, the VS Code extension is available on the marketplace, and we go to the marketplace over here, and we can just search for F5, and this shows you the F5 VS Code extension, where it integrates with TMOS products, Big IP, and all the different automation toolchain pieces, and it also talks to Big IQ and helps you understand the devices that are there, and really provides a platform to create automations, deploy applications, deploy Big IPs. We also have some other VS Code extensions out there, the F5 Networks iRules and also the iApps. These are all done by Bitwise Cook or James Duiker. He's been maintaining his own extensions for many years now and was also a big inspiration in where I was going in these. There's also Nginx Instance Manager. This was a very early release, probably almost 2 years ago when Nginx Instance Manager first came around. But what it does, it provides an interface to talk to an instance manager, list your instances, and help get, author, manage, configure, or change Nginx configuration files, and then deploy them across your fleet as a cluster. The latest extension that I've been working on is F5 Flipper. Now this is really focused on taking all the functionality and the work that's happened in many of the other F5 extensions and focusing on Citrix or NetScaler. So there's a piece where we can take in an F5 or a NetScaler configuration. We'll break that down, abstract the different applications, and then we can start providing some diagnostics or statistics about those applications and help you understand, are they a load balancer, is it a content server, what's the VIP, what are the destinations, what are the features or functionality of these different applications. And then in the future, there's some thoughts about how can we move those applications to different F5 technologies. So that might be a little bit out of the realm here, but just know that it's out there and any feedback is appreciated. The next one on our list here is ACC Chariot. So ACC is the AS3 configuration converter, which is a little tool provided by F5PD to the public to take in a TMOS configuration or Big IP conf file, and it will break down the applications and convert the configuration in its entirety to AS3 declarations, which is part of our modern deployment methodology for applications. This is just a small piece of the bigger picture there. And if you're looking for the more modern pieces, ACC has been integrated into a project or a tool called F5 Journeys that will connect to existing big IPs. It will bring in all your applications. and it will help you understand what features and functionality and migrate to things like Big IP Next, which is kind of our next gen technology, Big IP load balancer, and even other things like some diagnostics about if that application go to Nginx or even F5 distributed cloud, right? Moving some of those applications from on-prem Big IP TMOS to distributed cloud and moving them to a SaaS solution. And then the other the other extension is the IAP extension from James Doiker or Bitwise Cook. So now that we have these installed, and the window reloads, we're going to get this F5 globe on the left. And here is where you can see a lot of the basic features before we even connected. We have a list of all the F5 devices in our environment. We can add more, we can delete them. The password is actually cached. So once we get a successful connection, we'll save that password into a vault within the computer, along with other keys and other applications. And as long as you get successful authentications, we'll keep that password. But once you get a failed authentication on that password, we're going to clear it and prompt you for a new one. Down here, we have a configuration explorer we'll get to here in a little bit. And then if you're ever lost along your way, there's all kinds of documentation and examples. So you can get right into the repos for all the different automation services that F5 provides. Declarative onboarding, that's all about onboarding your device and setting basic system configuration settings. AS3 is going to be your application service templates 3. So that's how we're deploying applications in a declarative manner. And then telemetry streaming is going to be streaming all the telemetry from an F5, right? Most customers, most companies out there are still doing the good old syslog destination, and then they're having some sort of service crawl the SNMP and pull out all the details about the virtual servers, maybe pools, pool members, throughput, and that provides a pretty good view of everything that's happening. Well, as a modern way to push these details or even set up a pool, you can use telemetry streaming to gather all that on a system and kind of post it on a regular basis. So that's been another very popular one. Cloud failover is an extension that allows the Big IP to connect deeper into cloud environments. So like Azure, you can have it, so you can set it up to where when an F5 fails over in Azure, it will actually tell Azure to, instead of to point to the newly active F5 instance, and that can dramatically decrease your failover times there. So that's just more of a cloud integration. And then there's also, we've been working on some updated APM, modern APM scenarios, deployments, and services. And this was some examples of how we might do more of a declarative APM approach. And that is definitely more in development at this point. So in my lab, I have some different big IPs, and if you haven't connected to them yet, you won't have an icon, but these you'll see that I have connected to. I have nothing on the bottom here other than a button to connect. But when I click on a core LTM that I have in my lab, in the bottom here, it's going to make a bunch of API calls. So we have details that I've cached about the instance so we can better understand them. We can also see this here. And then there's a bunch of API calls that it makes to connect to the Big IP and discover things about the Big IP. We're going to get stuff like licensing, TMOS version. We're also going to understand what services are running. So what is AS3 on the box, is declarative onboarding, all these things to help us provide an interface, or at least understand what kind of Big IP device we're connecting to. So it's going to go. Sometimes they take a little bit longer, and then we also have a token timer. So this will get a new token every time it's needed, and we won't have to go back and get a cookie or a new token every time we want to connect to it. And you can see that token timer happening here. Once this is complete, we're going to see a whole new screen kind of pop up and show us all the different things and features and capabilities that are there. But until then, we're going to jump right into AS3 and mess around with some of those things. So here I double clicked and opened an editor, and like the schema reference, having snippets in VS Code was very powerful to give me chunks of code that I can quickly reuse for other application deployments. So in here, if I type in AS, this gives me an AS3 sample, which is a very simple application. Up here is the schema reference that I was talking about. So this tells VS Code in its own way that there's a schema for this entire JSON blob, and it's going to get that schema from this API endpoint. So it caches it locally, and now it starts to utilize that. So if I open up another bracket, well, that's AI trying to understand what we can do. It's going to give me all the different options that are available via the schema at this level. So say I want to I want to change my log level, and then it also tells me what the parameters for this particular piece are available, and I just want to do, debug. If I come down here into a tenant and I'm in the tenant class, if I open up now, I can see that, do I want this enabled? Do I want this in a route domain, or do I want to set a remark here? And then I can finish that. So without this schema reference, you have no feedback about how you're authoring or making modifications as you're going. Now with the schema, it's all better. Jumping back to the rest of what we were talking about, we got all these APIs called and we got responses back. You can see we got some OK200s, and I tried to link them together with a little 4-digit code, so you can see that when call was made and when we got a response back and what that response was. So this output is very good for watching, for logging, seeing what's going on. If you hit a bug or an error or trying to figure out what's going on, you can kind of see a lot of what's happening here, including how we're deploying AS3, how we're deploying declarative onboarding, those applications, the different settings, and how we're actually following up with that API endpoint asynchronously. And if it's still making API calls and waiting for responses, it means that we're still waiting for that service or that job to complete at the endpoint. But on the left here, you can see how a lot of things opened up. That from a big IP perspective, we give you some visibility into the different automation toolchain pieces out there. And so this is where fast is. Orange means that it's installed, but it's not the latest version. And then it tells you all the different versions. So this will try on a daily basis. It will go out and it will check all the different repos for all the different projects, and it will pull in all the information about the different releases. So this is refreshed on a daily basis. If you want to uninstall something, just hit uninstall, and it'll tell the big IP to uninstall the RPM and reset it. If you want to install something new, you can just click on the version. It'll download it to your local F5 and then upload it to the F5 and install it. Same thing for, UCS and QKView. We can see what those packages are, but it's still working through some features in order to get the VS Code extension to actually create those for you. But this gives you good visibility into, or makes it really easy to start working with the F5 automated tool chain by just connecting to your big IP and hitting a couple buttons over here. It'll install it and you can start working with it. Big exclaimer here, or just a warning: do not do this on a production device. We don't want to be installing services. You're going to have some things that need to reboot, maybe some drive space eaten up, things like that. I highly recommend doing all of this work in a development area, so that way you can reboot the device, you can hit it with all these APIs and do whatever you want. Just don't do this in production. Thank you. From there, if fast is installed, we get a fast view and we can see the different applications that have been deployed with fast. I don't have any. And then the different templates and template sets, and we can get into fast and how we we do that later on. If AS3 is installed, we see the different AS3 tenants, and I can click on this one and see that I have an AS3 application declaration, and this is for an external proxy. And these are all the details for it. So one of the cool things is, now that I know about AS3, I've connected to the device. You can also see along the bottom that it quickly shows you what services are enabled on the box and what those versions are. And from here, I can also right click, and now I can post this as an AS3 declaration. So within a couple clicks, I was able to get the application, the declaration for this particular application. I can make changes to a virtual address. I can copy it or do whatever I want. I can change the tenant name. And then from here, I can post this AS3 declaration. So the VS Code extension is managing everything from the beginning, to installing the automated toolchain packages, to helping you write the declarations for automation, and then deploying that automation in an environment. Another thing to note is that this was not developed or built to be an automation tool, but more of an automation workbench. So it's going to help you build these automation pieces and test them on a particular device in an environment. And then you start putting this into your bigger automation solutions, which is going to be something more like Ansible. Maybe you have some ServiceNow integration, things like that. So from here, I can click, I can post the AS3 declaration, and you can see these other ones are grayed out. It means that they're not installed or they're not available, right? It's not working. So there's no cloud failover installed, there's no telemetry streaming, and there's a bunch of other little things in here to make things easier. You can convert an AS3 application to fast, a fast template. So this is a quick conversion of that one application to a fast template. It's basically Jinja on steroids. And then from here, I can also, let's see if this still works. So we can render that. And so it took this template and it rendered the HTML output as a fast template, and then it gave me a whole new output. So this is how you can templatize your AS3 applications after you've tested them. You can templatize them, and then you can take these templates and put them on big IPs. You can manage them through big IQ, or you can integrate them into your ServiceNow solutions. Do we have any questions so far? Okay. So one of the other things I wanted to talk about in the extension that have been a huge part of my daily life and enabled a bunch of others that I've talked with is the Big IP Configuration Explorer. So let's look at our TCL objects. These are iRules, iCall scripts, TMSH scripts, IApps, things like that. So you have visibility, you can manage and update your iRules from VSCode. But the important thing I wanted to talk about is close our documentation. Is this. You can import a UCS QKView or F5 conf file, and it will break it down. For an example, we have this button here that'll load an example QKView. This is what I use in my development, and this is what I'm running all my tests against. So it has a decent amount of applications and a good variety of configuration options. Once that configuration gets pulled in, we can see the bottom here. So looks like we got a little problem there, but we open the archive. We pulled out a bunch of different files, whole lot of files here, even all the different partitions. And then we abstract all the applications. We give you a little feedback about the amount of virtual servers, profiles, policies, iRules, even some GTM details, ASM policies, ASM policies, and then how long all this stuff took. But it gives you this over here. And so if I hover, it gives you another quick output of that. And then we have some reports we'll come back to in a second. It shows us all the sources. The cool thing is that if you click on the sources header, it will give you all of the source files together. So if we miss something in that abstraction process, we can search for it here. We'll take that out. We'll do a Control F, and then we'll look for node. And so now, using our gutter and our highlighting on the right, we can surf through this entire configuration and look for all of our nodes. Now, this would really apply to if you have a specific application name or looking for any unique nouns or anything like that within your environment, you can quickly see all the pieces in here. So moving on, and I'm moving a little quickly because there's a lot of stuff to talk about, but it breaks down all of your applications by partition. So in here we have different things that are going on, and it's all based on diagnostics. So diagnostics is really just a rule set that uses regex, and we're looking for particular things in the configuration, right? We know that the structure of the configuration file, and we can identify whether this particular group of text is a virtual server. Maybe we've identified that there is a particular persistence, or there's an iRule with functionality in there. And then we have rules, and mainly these rules are right now are written to identify pieces of big IP applications that can or cannot, or maybe move to F5 distributed cloud as a SaaS service. Keep in mind about this rule set and this diagnostics is it can be modified, and it can be changed to do anything. You can change the different priorities and the different keys to identify different parts of your application or group your applications in different ways. So if I go to my common, you can see here that there's something about this forwarder, and when I hover, it says multi-point load balancers or wildcard VIPs aren't supported. Distributed cloud approaches applications more like Nginx. It's not just a VIP or an IP and a port, but it's more of an FQDN, and where we can multiplex applications from there. So, this application, very simple application, you have a green light, which means that there's nothing wrong here that would prevent it from being moved to another service. And that's just some of the examples that are going on here. From there, we have more information about the different GSLB records if DNS is enabled on the big IP. And you can kind of see how everything continues to expand and there's a lot of visibility. And I use this on almost a daily basis to help customers understand the scope and the size of their F5 configurations and understand, yeah, you have ASM installed and enabled, but are you really using it? Or, we don't use DNS. Well, I mean, we see it configured over here and you have 100 different FQDNs working. So it needs to be part of the scope and conversations as we're going forward. The final thing I wanted to show here was, a top talkers report. This helps me. I do an F1 and we're going to fold all. This helps me narrow in on the top applications, and customers have really enjoyed this, right? This gives you a list of the top talker applications that are in there by the different stats, and this gives you details on why. So the rank, this got a 16, it's the highest one here, and this is a listener, and it got this rank because it was the number one in packets in, bytes out, and probably all these others. You can see this in a couple different areas. So check it out. Any feedback is appreciated and very welcome. That's the diagnostics. Before we close that one, I wanted to show you the rule set and the flexibility there. So from here, we can talk about, let's look, our diagnostics. So go to our, so the top talkers, the question is, how do we refresh the diagnostics and how do we update the top talkers? So that's two different things here. The top talkers will come from XML statistics within the QK view. So a lot of what I work with is QK views. Take that QK view, import it into VS Code, and that's where you're going to get all your statistics. If you try to do this with a conf file or even a UCS, we're not going to have those statistics in that configuration. So you're only going to see applications. So in order to get refreshed top talkers, you're going to need to take periodic QK views, or at least just that's the snapshot within the QK view at that time. Now the diagnostics, whenever you change it, it'll refresh the entire tree and reapply the diagnostics. So it's kind of taken for you, and we'll see that here. If we can turn off diagnostics or turn it back on, and we can also see that under partitions here. See how it turns off and on. But if I leave it on and I hit the pencil, this gives us our rule set. And you can see that these are very simple regexes. I can give you a message that has all the details. And we're planning on adding a lot more, links and external articles to better explain some of these rules. You also have a title and then a severity. The informational will give you like a gray wiggly line under it. An error will give you a red wiggly line. And then there's a warning and there's an informational. A warning is yellow, and informational I think is blue. And so you can change these different colors to do a bunch of really cool stuff, and you can see all the rules here. So if you modify something, just hit the save button or the save button here, or even a control S. And when you do that, it's going to refresh this tree every time. So it's kind of automatic. Does that answer your question? Yeah, thank you. All right. So that's the high level of Big IP extension and how it really integrates into TMOS, our products. It helps you do automations. It helps you get visibility into your current configuration, and even abstract some applications to move it somewhere else if you want. And now we're going to kind of peel everything back and look behind the sheets and see, how does this really work, right? How did I take all this stuff from Big IP and make it show up in the UI and VS Code? So if there's any developers out there, the way that happens is very similar to any other kind of library or project. From a VS Code perspective, an extension is just Java, and this is my limited knowledge, right? I'm definitely not a professional developer or anything, but VS Code extension is a JavaScript project running in its own environment, and it is calling functions that VS Code knows how to expect the data and make that show up in a UI, kind of like a website, right? It'll make an API call, it'll get data, and it'll put that data into certain things and show up in the UI. So as I close this window, and we're going to hop over to my other window, which is my development environment. Are there any questions so far, or any thoughts or topics or anywhere that you want me to focus on as we start looking at how the extension works within VS Code? Nope. All right.
One quick question. I was just curious if you can post to Big IP next with this VS Code extension.
Oh, yeah. So about 18 months ago, maybe almost 2 years ago, a while back, I did a lot of integration work with some of the early versions, and it would connect and it would start showing some of these things. They've done a lot of work and they've added a ton of features, and the product has grown a ton since then. So I've actually had to kind of rip some of that out, and now that Big IP Next is GA and they're solidifying a lot of the architectures and the APIs, it is on the roadmap to probably create a new extension to kind of enable all that connectivity. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. Because we get asked, hey, how do I migrate my VIPs to Next from classic Big IP TMOS, right? So this could be a good environment to do that, right? To have a declarative, a declarative declarative instance for classic Big IP, a declarative instance for Big IP Next to migrate those apps. But it sounds like we're not there yet.
Yes. So from a VS Code perspective, it's just been a timing thing.
Gotcha.
But I will say that the next team and all the different product teams, and there's a ton of pieces that go into kind of regenerating all that stuff. There is a current project out there called Project Journeys, or not project. It's the Journeys tool that is part of the central manager of Next, and it will take in a UCS and break down the applications, and it does a lot of these things, and that is the official response to helping customers migrate the old to the new. And it also has integrations for WAF policies and other specific features like that. So if you have needs at this time right now, we can get you in touch with the right people, and the central manager has tools to help with that.
Sounds good. No, I was just wondering if you can install AS3 on a Big IP partition, but you can install AS3 on Big IP Next or Big IP Next Central Manager, then really it becomes agnostic. So I don't know. It's something to explore in the future. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate the feedback.
Yeah, my pleasure. And the final thing that I will say about that is that AS3 is part of Big IP Next. There is a slightly different schema since all the features don't completely line up right now, but they are working to fill that gap as quick as possible. And that's kind of the idea, is that as customers, and that was a big impetus for really leaning into this extension and all the work, is that if we help customers migrate to AS3, not only does it help them standardize, solidify, and make their application deployment a lot easier to manage, but they can also take those declarative applications and move them right into Next as they start playing with the new technology.
That would be amazing. Sounds good. Thanks, man.
Yeah. There's a lot going on. Next has come a very long way, and I'm equally excited about it. I just need to find some time and put some development into it. There's also been a lot of asks about more distributed cloud integration, right? Moving applications, not just the diagnostics, but just actually moving applications or converting applications from Big IP TMOS, or we'll call it legacy for now, to distributed cloud where it can be managed globally. All right, so how do we develop a VS Code extension? So there are templates out there, and I won't go into all the details, but there's a ton of articles and documentation from Microsoft or the VS Code team about how to get started. It is all wrapped in what's TS. So it's TypeScript. TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript, to where all of your types all of your data is typed. So that way you're defining the shape of the data going in and out of functions. Is it a string? Is it a number? Is it an object? Things like that. And that forced me at an early stage in my development process to really understand the data as it comes and goes from all these different functions. And me personally, I feel like I spent a lot more time thinking about and solving problems that the code needed to do and not having to code defensively. So with typescripting, I didn't always have to write a whole bunch of tests or a whole bunch of validation of the data that came in and out, because it was validated through typescripting as we went through the process. So that, I think that was a big plus, but it was certainly a huge learning curve as part of the process. In this package.json is where VS Code reads all the initial details about the package of the project, and it also defines where the code is going to start in in the extension, which here is going to be the main, oh, here in the extension. So this is the first file that gets called in and run, and this is where we load all the different pieces of the extension that we're going to be using. I know I'm kind of rolling around here, but you can see all the different pieces, like the logger, where I'm injecting schemas, where I have other utilities, and then I start building all the different pieces. This is where we set up the output channel where you see all the logging, and then we have functions like the logger output. This is how I capture all those logs and I put them into the output after I've created it. I don't want any more logging of the console. And then this is VS Code will call this function to activate all the code within the extension, and that's when the rest of all this happens. So I'm catching all the errors that I didn't expect. I set up some telemetry to understand, what kind of devices we're connecting to, or what are the most popular features or functions that are getting called. And then the rest of this is just logging details about what's going on. I'm setting up and pulling in all of our settings. We load those settings. This is how we set up the extension bar on the bottom. So you can see this F5 connect. And then I create a text document where we're going to display some things. I build a token timer. And then here is where I call classes to enable all the different functionality across the board. And I tried to break that up in different ways. Are there any questions or comments or things that you would like to dive into? Because there's a lot of code here.
So I think one thing you just touched on is pretty interesting, which is as you load the extension, the extension itself is modular, right? So you now have this ability to load the framework of the extension and then start to code the individual features as classes that you're going to build. So I think, the the interesting part about that, right, is it allows you, you know, gives you a nice way, I guess, to focus your efforts on a specific area of the configuration you're either trying to parse or deal with, right? Versus having to unwind 10,000 lines of code and figure out what was where.
Yeah, and to be candid, that was part of the evolution of my development experience and writing this extension over the last couple of years, because I had everything in this main extension file, and you can see that I was putting headers here so I could read the gutter and I could quickly get to different pieces that I was coding. And then I had a bunch of functions and everything that was happening, but like it got really big really quickly. And I started, if we go back to the top here, I started exploring with different ways to have the extension call other code to bring that into the running program. So here we have, I'm just calling the class, and the calling of that class gets the code loaded into Node, and that's when functions and more things get populated into VS Code itself. And then down here, I just call other functions, and in there, it's kind of doing the same thing. So just calling a function actually loads it, and there's a bunch of other stuff going on. So like which one do we want to look at? We can look at AS3 since most people are familiar with that. So that AS3 core gets added. It's added up here. Oh, in my AS3 core file. And so we can go look at that. Source AS3 core. And so in here, we bring in the extension context. So this is everything about the extension and how it's running. What's the software? What kind of OS? what versions, and then all the environment variables and all the things happening. So there's a lot of information that I need in order to pass back in there via the extension context. And this is where I fire up the AS3 tree provider that we saw, right? I can go over here and we can connect to my lab, right? So we'll do core LTM01. And this doesn't even get into, there's a whole nother class in order to populate this big IP information or this AS3 view. So that was a really fun one that we can jump into here in a minute. But once this is how we set up that tree in the view. And then this is how we register or push the different commands that we set up in VS Code. So when you call a command, it looks for it, and then it passes it information if it needs to pass information. And this is what you're seeing here. So this is the command, and then it's going to pass the item that this command was associated with in the UI. So in this case, it would be get the declarations, and that would be right here, get all tenants. So when I click this, it calls this command and passes in this information. And then from here, we try to figure out what to do with it. Sometimes get declarations is called the F1. So if I do an F1, I type an F5, this is a whole nother way to issue that command, and it might have different details associated with it. Like these tenants, they have information about the tenants and the declarations injected into these different objects or these UI pieces, where they don't have that in the F1 view here. So we've got to figure out where the button got called from, and then we got to go get the details about it. And sometimes, if we want to render that into another panel, or if we just want to say we failed, right? And then we can kind of move on from there. Expand the tenant, delete the tenant. And now we're coming down to the last 13 minutes. The cool thing I wanted to show here, and this took me, it took me months for me to get my head around this. How does a class, or how does the data managed to make these views on the left? Because that was pretty cool. So if we go here and we do AS3 tree provider, that's in my tree providers. Did somebody ask a question? No? Okay. So if I go into my tree providers, these are all the different views that you see on the left, and these are these trees that you see, the browsers, I guess. If I go to my AS3 tree view, I implement a data tree provider, which means that VS Code is expecting this class to be of a different of a particular shape and have particular functions and data within it. And this is where we set up some of the events that happen with emitting some of those buttons, or when they're clicked. This is where we set a bunch of information about the declarations and the AS3s. And for visibility purposes, I even broke down the different AS3 declarations and how many applications were in it and things like that, so we can quickly view them. And then if there's targets in there, which means that we're talking a big IQ, there's a refresh button. So when you click, we come over here and we click refresh, it calls this, it's connected to a command that connects to this function. And this is where we clear everything out, and then we start over. This is where it gets interesting. So as VS Code says, okay, I'm going to display this view, I'm going to call this function, get the children to display items within the view. And if I don't give it an element, so here's if there's an element, if I don't get an element, where's it at? Here we go. This is where I'm going to populate all the parent objects, which in this is going to be tenants and tasks. So it wasn't asking for a child. So in here, this is where I get all my tenants and I get all my tasks. And then I start pulling out details like how many tasks, how many tenants, and how many declaration maps, right? So this information that you're hovering with, this is where I'm looping through targets and pulling out, munging the data. I create each one of these objects, so these menu items, and then I return them all as tree items, which have a particular shape that VS Code is expecting. So it has to have a label, a description, some context and tooltips. And this is how we manage like this hover, right? That's a tooltip. Context allows me to say that when this button happens, under certain contexts, do other things. And so I can catch an event, I can look at that context, and I can say when this was clicked, maybe I want to disconnect from an F5, or maybe I want to refresh something on the side. This allows me to really hone in on that asynchronous state of Node or JavaScript and do things asynchronously. And so we'll come back up here. I'll get my tenants, get my tasks. I had to get this information at this point so that way I can get you the numbers, how many tenants and how many tasks were there. But right now, this is all we see. So we just got high level information and numbers about the number of tenants and number of tasks. When you click, here, we can do this. Now, if I go, sorry, I'm kind of bouncing around. If we stop here and debug, so I'm going to debug this for you real quick, and we're gonna figure this out. I know we're down to the last 9 minutes, and this will be the last one. So I'm going to connect to my Big IP lab. So on the other window that I showed you, the original VSCode instance, I'm connecting to my lab. And in a second here, okay, we connected. And now I just expanded that AS3 view, and it went through here and it called the get children. So right now, if I hover, it's undefined, which means that it's now populating that parent level of data, and there's no elements, and it's going to go through and give me those parent elements that I described earlier. I'm going to hit F5 and continue on, and it's done. It provided the data, and now it's waiting for me to do my next one. So I'm going to click on expanding the tenants like we had talked about before. So now this time I clicked on the tenant, and now my element shows that the label is tenants. Remember that tooltip that I showed you, get all tenants, and there's some context, and then there's also command information in here, like how many arguments. And I can really dive into, apparently there's an AS3 declaration in here, right? So this hovering and debugging was really cool for me. I thought that this was just super enabling during my development. But in here, now I can say, if the label is a tenant, I'm going to get details about the tenants. So I'll move this around. So now that my element is a tenant, I'm going to go through all of my tenants, and I'm going to start ripping out information and understand how many applications I have, what are the different statistics, and this is where I start appending the code blocks and turning it into YAML and doing that hover stuff that I was telling you about. So, and then I create my view item, and I push that back. So this is where we're going to get our app count, right? If I come down to here, I can hover and get my app count, a simplified declaration. Deprecation max, excuse me, application string. And then when the view comes, when it's populated, is it collapsed? Is it collapsible? Or can I have the user click on it to expand and get me more? And so this is where this process will start all over. So it's collapsed, and when somebody clicks on it to expand it, it's going to go through this process again, but say, now I want you to give me the information or the children related to this tenant. And this just kind of keeps going, and we can add icons, and we can do all kinds of stuff like you see over here. I'm able to add icons, I can do hovers, I can add buttons to the top, to the side, and each one of these, they just call a command, and depending on how the command is called, sometimes it has data, sometimes it doesn't, and kind of fitting all this stuff together on the backside. So that is a very rough introduction to VS Code, the F5 extension, and kind of how it all works under the sheets. Any questions?
I don't see any now, but I want to say thank you, because it's a cool dive into really kind of what's happening underneath the covers, right? I think for any of us that are VS Code users, you just go install an extension and don't really think about what it actually took to get it there, right? And so seeing the level of effort that it takes to build one of those and get get it functional, and really even thinking about the fact of the level of mindfulness you have to put into it to make it not only readable and manageable, but line up with the usability of VS Code is really cool. So thank you for joining us today and sharing that with the group, because that is really cool.
My pleasure. It's definitely been a passion project of mine. This is not endorsed or affiliated with F5 corporate at all. This is just something that, as a network engineer, learning and wanting to do better, I wanted to create something that everybody else could take value of, right? So this is open source. You can look at the code. Anybody can use it. Anybody can expand on it. I've been a little busy over the last year, but it's really for everybody. So thank you.
Yeah, so I was going to ask if it was open source, and if you could share the repository, that would be great.
Yeah, so that is all. I can share it here. I can share it afterwards, but in the documentation, it's all part of it. So let me pull that up, and there's a whole documentation website too. So if we have a couple minutes, I don't know if you can go over or not, but I will. I can dive into that if you want.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, more sharing. Sharing is caring. Let's do this. So Google, and then we've got our account, and then over here we got VSCode F5. So this is the repo, and I can put that into, where's my chat? I don't know where my chat is. I'm gonna have to follow up with that afterwards. But in here, this is the main repo. And then there's a couple other projects. So F5 connects 4. This is the one I was working on earlier. So the thought here is that as I was making the VS Code extension, I got a good amount into it, but I was like, hey, I could use these functions to do other things. Like we could integrate this directly into GitHub Actions and have an entire repo just do all this through programmatically, or we can create a yeah, I'll increase that. Or we can create a CLI to where this could be a lot easier to manage and use. So I took all the core functionality from VS Code and I pretty much packaged this into a JavaScript library, and that's what you see here. So there's a lot of information about how we make REST calls, and a side note, in the extension, there's also things for changing things into JSON and then into YAML. There's things for encoding and decoding base64. So there's a lot of little right clicks and nice to haves that make your job a lot easier. There's also times to where if you're looking at particular pieces of an F5 configuration file, it will decrypt a base64 encoded I rule and show you how it's all laid out. So there's a lot of good things in here. This is mainly interested in all the REST calls that happen, managing of the token and connecting to a big IP and doing all those things for you. Key things to remember is that we are, when it comes to AS3, we're doing everything asynchronous by default. So just making that a whole lot easier. In here, if I go to like source, this is a cool thing to show. And then we do big IP. There's other things in here, like there's AS3 tools. This is for helping breaking down tenets and declarations. This is the AS3 client that has all the details about how we're connecting to a big IP and the tenants and the constructor, and then posting declarations, deleting tenants. There's one in here that's drawing a blank on where that's at, but there's also, let's see, VS Code, F5. There's a whole documentation website. So if you're here, you can go directly to the GitHub repo, or you can go directly to the documentation. And this is a little dated also, but I tried to document everything that was going on. So this tells you all the basics, how to get the extension, different marketplace, some visuals on how to do the initial connecting and creating of things. And then there's device management, big IQ auth provider, how there's nuances and the difference between how the big IP and big IQ manage auth providers, how to manage the output logging, where the settings are at and all that, where that happens, using device labels to group different big IPs in different areas, how to see the hundreds. This is just a small subset of the commands that are available. Hey, this was my first command that I ever did in VS Code, was to go get a Chuck joke. I don't know if that one's still around. I might have to look for that. Like It's an API, and you just make it, and it helped me stay sane during my development. So I'll leave that there for you guys. Schema validation, how does that work? How does it work in different documents? How to inject it? How to remove it? The different things about telemetry streaming, configuration explorer. It can do generic REST calls. So if you're connected to a big IP, there's a couple of different ways that you can make just regular calls to a big IP and kind of browse the API. Or if you're not connected to an F5, it's looking for HTTP. This will actually make a call outside. So it's kind of like a middle ground of Postman. And then there's some documentation about the diagnostics. There's also a bunch of utilities in here to really help while you're doing stuff. This on connect or on disconnect, I had this set up in my lab to where anytime it connected to an F5, it would go ahead, it would use the terminal to log into the CLI. So that way I had the CLI and I was already ready to look at logs and stuff like that. The remote command execute was another really cool one, to where it would use the raw API endpoint that I could execute any command. So I could look at config files, I could look at logs, like I could do anything that the VSCode extension didn't already do and move on from there. And then there's links to different code repos and things like that. So that is all public. That is all out there. One final repo that I'll put out there is going to be, oh, what did I call that? That was the F5 corkscrew. This is the engine behind all of how the configuration explorer works. So this is how we take in configuration archives, UCS, QKViews, comp files, and break them down and do different things with them. And then this is what led into F5 project Flipper. That was not where I was going. Oh, let's try that again. It looks like my my SEO changed. So that's going to be VSCode F5 Flipper. There we go. Code. So this has very similar functions and things that that happen in the main VS Code extension. 5 minutes over. Sorry about that.
No worries. Again, thanks for the time and presenting. For everybody that attended, I will make sure that we get the repos posted that are of importance as well. You'll find those out on the WWT community, where we archive the recordings, as well as we did live stream on YouTube, so this will be out there as well.
Nice.
If anybody has any further questions, please speak up now. Otherwise, we'll let everybody get on with their day. Thanks again to Ben, and we'll see everybody with our next session when we get that scheduled.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone.